Imagine the heart of a vast empire beginning to lose strength, and no one manages to stop the impending catastrophe. Across the immense lands of Russia, a silent chain reaction unfolds, shaking the economic foundations that support Vladimir Putin's power. From ancient and proud oil refineries, now symbols of the Russian industry, columns of smoke rise after their devastation. The burning rubble reveals a meticulously planned destruction, not mere accidents or isolated events. This is a strategic and precise attack designed to break the backbone of the Russian economy. In just 2 weeks, Ukrainian defense forces have carried out a series of surgical strikes, devastating 4 key refineries, including the facility in Saratov. Experts warn that Russian refinery capacity may have already exceeded its critical limit. While it was previously thought that destroying refining capacity could cause a collapse, current estimates indicate that between 17 and 20% of that capacity is damaged or out of service, an impact that shakes global energy markets and sends a warning signal about the financial stability of the Russian state. The outlook is grim. Russia faces the dilemma of either completely halting oil production, which is technically complex and extremely costly, or selling crude at extremely low prices, which would devastate its own revenues. In both cases, the Kremlin is threatened by a massive loss of resources that puts the funding of its war machinery at risk. The population immediately notices the consequences on the streets, with long lines at gas stations. In several regions, reduced refinery capacity automatically translates into less gasoline available, driving up prices and causing shortages. Inflation, already looming as a shadow over the economy, accelerates at an alarming rate. Transportation costs rise, factories must pay more to distribute their products, and nearly all goods in the country become more expensive. The systematic destruction of refineries strikes directly at the lifeblood of the Russian economy. The oil industry has been the financial pillar supporting Putin's war capability, and now that foundation is beginning to crack. Investors are withdrawing, unable to risk billions in infrastructure that could be destroyed at any moment by Ukrainian attacks. Even propagandists, experts at masking bad news, show signs of unease, publicly debating about those responsible in failures, while the population experiences firsthand the consequences: hours of waiting at stations, rising transportation costs, and increasing prices for basic foods and consumer products. This is a clear example of economic destabilization: less fuel, high prices, rising inflation, declining purchasing power, and growing social dissatisfaction. The Ukrainian strategy targets the core of Russian power directly. Every refinery set ablaze means less income, fewer investments, less control over the war, and growing uncertainty within the Kremlin. The destruction affects not only the material, but also the psychological perception. Russia's image as an energy power is deeply damaged. The confidence of citizens, investors, and even international adversaries erodes. Experts warn that if these attacks continue, they could trigger a chain reaction that collapses the entire oil industry, from producers to refineries and the banks that finance them. The threat becomes increasingly evident. Each new Ukrainian strike on a refinery tightens the noose around Putin's economy, while the Russian population begins to feel the first real consequences. Long lines at gas stations, the steady rise in gasoline prices, and uncertainty about fuel availability are just the visible manifestations of a much deeper problem. Specialists warn that the systematic destruction of refineries not only creates temporary shortages, but could destabilize the entire oil infrastructure for years. Companies like Surgutnefgaz, one of Russia's largest oil producers, are already facing serious operational difficulties, and if they falter, this could trigger a chain reaction affecting producers, refineries, distributors, and financial institutions simultaneously. The repercussions for the Kremlin would be devastating: loss of foreign currency income, an increasingly weakened budget, and the decline of geopolitical power Russia has maintained for decades thanks to its position as an energy superpower. Economic reality clashes with the psychological narrative of strength. For years, oil and gas have symbolized national power, the source of political influence and pride in the country's global presence. However, every refinery set on fire erodes that facade. Investors withdraw. Technological sanctions impede the modernization or repair of damaged facilities, and the technical knowledge of international experts is no longer available, representing a double blow to an already weakened industry. At the same time, the destruction intensifies social tensions. Rising fuel prices increase the cost of living. Companies are forced to adjust their rates, fueling even more popular discontent. The social consequences are evident: declining real incomes, growing frustration, and a latent risk of economic instability. Meanwhile, Ukraine's military campaign becomes more precise and forceful, and internal cracks in Russia become visible. Public accusations in the media, disputes over responsibilities, and growing panic among officials and oil executives are clear signs that the system is under pressure. For the population, this means long hours waiting at gas stations and exorbitant prices for food, transportation, and consumer goods. A daily reality that generates growing rejection toward the country's economic leadership. From both an economic and political perspective, this is a strategic blow that goes far beyond immediate destruction. Every attack on refineries is a calculated move shaking the foundations of Russian power. Experts emphasize that this is not a passing problem. If the attacks continue, there is a risk of structural collapse in the oil industry that could drag the entire nation into a downward economic spiral. The consequences would not only be financial, but also geopolitical. Russia would lose the ability to manage its international relations through energy policy, and war financing would be severely restricted. The psychological impact is also immense. The image of a strong, energy-independent Russia crumbles as uncertainty grows among citizens, investors, and political decision-makers. Observers worldwide perceive the gravity of the situation. These attacks not only show weakness but also the strategic effectiveness of the Ukrainian offensive. While refineries burn and black smoke columns darken the sky, a scenario Moscow hasn't experienced in decades begins to take shape: the precise erosion of its economic and geopolitical power through a planned economic strike. Tensions continue to rise. With each refinery complex destroyed, the Russian economic system faces increasing pressure, and chain reactions reach deeper sectors. Currently, transportation costs rise considerably, as fuel shortages force trucks distributing food, construction materials, and consumer products to absorb higher expenses that are directly passed on to consumers. This phenomenon progresses relentlessly. Inflation soars, real incomes decrease, and the population's purchasing power progressively weakens. Specialists warn that this creates a classic vicious cycle. Rising prices reduce consumption, weakening the economy, affecting businesses, and each new wave of inflation hits citizens harder. The psychological impact within Russia should not be underestimated. For decades, the oil and gas industry symbolized national strength, an emblem of global power and financial independence. However, now these icons are being systematically destroyed, and the population begins to question the foundations of power. Politically, internal tensions intensify. Open blame in the media and debate programs, disputes within the government and among oil sector leaders show that the Kremlin is increasingly on the defensive. No one can deny the destruction anymore, and public perception is rapidly changing. What was once an image of unbreakable strength is turning into fear and uncertainty. At the same time, Ukrainian attacks keep refineries under constant pressure, and the precision of these strikes indicates strategic planning, not mere coincidences. Investors pull out capital, modernization projects stall, and exit from the sector could cause the system's definitive rupture. The international repercussions are enormous. Sanctions and uncertainty cause Russian petroleum product sales to decline. Traditional buyers hesitate to sign new contracts, and transportation costs for remaining deliveries increase drastically. For Moscow, this means not only a loss of foreign currency but also a reduction in its geopolitical influence. Each destroyed refinery complex represents a direct blow to the Kremlin, an intentional weakness that threatens the long-term warfighting capacity and economic stability. Experts point to companies like Surgutneftegas, whose difficulties serve as an early warning sign. When major producers collapse, the entire oil value chain destabilizes, from refineries to traders and financial institutions supporting the system. The social consequences are equally severe. Citizens line up at gas stations, paying exorbitant prices. Companies pass costs on to consumers, increasing general dissatisfaction. Inflationary pressure, falling purchasing power, and growing frustration could lead to mass protests and political unrest, putting the fragile balance between government and population at risk. Analysts emphasize that this situation is not temporary. The destruction of refineries threatens to destabilize the entire Russian oil industry for years. Even if the conflict ended tomorrow, reconstruction would require hundreds of billions of dollars and many years to overcome technological setbacks. Technical sanctions, lack of specialized knowledge, and the withdrawal of international investors worsen the crisis. Each new explosion deepens the wound, and the Russian state faces a crucial decision: halt production, risk market saturation with crude oil, or attempt to rebuild refineries under constant threat. Each alternative involves enormous losses and considerable political risks. The ruble is under heavy pressure, inflation continues to rise, and the threat of unemployment looms increasingly, while the capacity to finance the war and the state is running out. The Ukrainian campaign not only demonstrates overwhelming military force but also strategic cunning in the economic sphere. By focusing attacks on the oil industry, they strike the Kremlin right at its most vulnerable point. Time moves relentlessly, and the Russian Empire, dependent on oil, approaches its limits. Each refinery that burns brings Moscow one step closer to the abyss. The economic effects are already palpable. The ruble plummets, inflation soars, and food and consumer product prices rise sharply, while the population's patience begins to wear thin. The Kremlin faces a harsh reality. No source of income is invulnerable. No decision is free of risks. Every action implies a cost, and every delay worsens the crisis further. International observers warn that the destruction of refineries not only causes short-term shortages, but could destabilize the entire Russian oil and gas industry, with profound consequences for banks, producers, and the global energy market. The psychological impact is also devastating. For decades, Russia had established itself as an energy superpower, proud of its oil and gas reserves, a symbol of its global strength. However, that illusion is breaking. Investor confidence erodes, internal tensions rise, and adversaries see an opportunity to weaken Russia's international position. The long-term outlook is bleak. Rebuilding destroyed refineries would take years, cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and be complicated by international sanctions, lack of technology, and expert flight. Meanwhile, psychological pressure on the Russian population intensifies. Endless lines, uncontrolled prices, and deteriorating purchasing power fuel discontent and distrust towards the government. With each precise attack, Ukraine demonstrates that economic warfare can be as powerful as military operations. If this strategy continues, Russia could not only lose its warfighting capacity but also its long-term economic and geopolitical strength. This would imply a profound shift in the global energy structure, a reevaluation of geopolitical alliances, and possibly a new era of economic instability for Moscow. As black smoke rises over the ruins of the refineries, the world understands that the destruction of the Russian oil empire is not a passing blow, but the beginning of a structural transformation confronting the Kremlin with challenges that until recently seemed unimaginable. The crucial question remains: will Russia find a path to stability, or will this oil empire inevitably plunge into an economic abyss? And you, dear viewers, do you believe Moscow can overcome this crisis? Or are we witnessing the end of its illusion as an energy superpower?